The sun set slowly over the horizon of the human retirement colony, casting a warm orange glow across the peaceful landscape. The colony was a quiet place, filled with memories of past wars and battles. It was a place where the old veterans, those who had fought in some of the galaxy's bloodiest wars, now lived out their peaceful days. They spent their time gardening, telling stories, and reminiscing about the battles they had survived. The air smelled of fresh grass, and the sound of birds singing was the only thing that could be heard, making it seem like nothing could ever disturb their tranquility. In the main square of the colony, a group of veterans gathered around a table, playing a card game. Their hands were worn, their faces weathered by time and war. Their bodies may have grown old, but their minds were sharp, and they never forgot the lessons learned on the battlefield. General Marcus, one of the oldest veterans, sat at the head of the table. He had seen it all, countless battles, invasions, and attacks. Yet, today, he was just another old man, enjoying his retirement. He laughed with his friends, sharing old war stories, and for a moment, there was no threat, no enemy, no war. The peace seemed perfect. The veterans had earned it. For years, they had fought, bled, and lost comrades in distant worlds. Now, they were free to live in peace, away from the chaos of the universe. But peace, they knew, was fragile. It was something they had all fought for, but none of them ever truly believed it would last forever. As the evening went on, the sky above the colony started to change. The sun disappeared behind a thick cloud, and a strange darkness began to creep across the sky. It wasn't a storm, but something felt off. General Marcus noticed it first. His sharp eyes, trained through years of battle, could sense the tension in the air. Something was wrong. He squinted into the distance, but there was nothing visible yet. Still, the feeling of unease settled deep within him. He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking, and motioned for the others to pay attention. A low hum filled the air, barely noticeable at first. But then it grew louder, more distinct. The veterans all stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky. Their old instincts kicked in, and they recognized the sound instantly. It was the unmistakable sound of enemy ships. The hair on the back of their necks stood up. The first ship appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. It was followed by another, then another. In a matter of moments, the peaceful sky was filled with enemy ships, their sleek designs shining under the lights of the distant stars. It was too late to run, and there was nowhere to hide. The veterans knew it. The colony, once a place of peace and safety, was under attack. The attackers didn't know what they were up against. They thought the veterans here were just old men and women, living out their final days. But the veterans knew better. They had fought in wars that spanned galaxies, against enemies more powerful than the ones attacking now. The newcomers had no idea who they were dealing with. General Marcus's hand moved to his side, where his old sidearm still rested, a weapon he had used in countless battles. His fingers wrapped around it, and he could feel the familiar weight in his hand. The veterans were ready. They had trained their whole lives for moments like this. But this time, it wasn't a war they had prepared for, it was the fight of their lives to protect the only place they had left to call home. As the ships moved closer, the veterans began to move. There was no time to waste. They rushed into action, taking their positions around the colony, ready to defend what they had fought so hard to protect. But even as they prepared, they knew the odds were against them. The enemy ships were many, and the veterans were older. They were no longer the young soldiers they once were. But one thing had not changed, their will to fight. They would fight to protect the peace they had earned. The sound of enemy fire echoed in the distance, followed by the first explosion, which sent a shockwave through the ground. The attack had begun. The calm before the storm was over. Now, it was time for the veterans to show the enemy that you never truly leave the battlefield, no matter how old you are. The first explosion shook the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The peaceful colony that had been home to so many veterans for years now trembled under the weight of an unknown enemy. The attackers weren't just any foes, they were fast, organized, and ruthless. The veterans had hoped for a peaceful retirement, but now they realized that the world they had built was under siege. There was no more time for games, no more time for rest. The fight had begun. General Marcus's heart raced, but his mind remained calm. He had fought in countless wars, but even he had never seen an attack like this. The enemy ships were massive, dwarfing the colony's defenses. They moved swiftly through the sky, launching laser fire and bombs that exploded on impact. The colony's communication systems were already down, and there was no way to call for help. The veterans didn't panic. They had been through worse. In fact, many of them had seen entire planets fall to invading forces. But this time, it was personal. This was their home. And it wasn't just the veterans under attack, it was everyone. The children, the families, the peaceful lives they had fought so hard to protect. The veterans scrambled into action, grabbing weapons they hadn't touched in years. Some of them had retired from active duty years ago, but the old instincts kicked in immediately. They knew what had to be done. The younger generation of soldiers was not here. It was up to them, the older warriors, to defend their home. Private Lucas, a retired sniper who had spent most of his life on the front lines, moved swiftly toward the highest point in the colony. He needed a vantage point to see the enemy's movements. His hands were steady as he set up his old sniper rifle, now rusted but still deadly in the right hands. He adjusted the scope, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon. From his perch, he could see the enemy ships moving toward the colony. They were more organized than he expected, each one following a precise path. Meanwhile, Sergeant Helena, an expert in hand-to-hand combat, was already leading a group of veterans toward the colony's defense tower. They had to take back control of the weapons systems. She had fought in battles where the odds were stacked against her, but she knew this was different. This was no longer about territory or politics, it was about survival. The veterans weren't alone in the fight. The civilians, though untrained, were doing everything they could to help. Some of the older men and women, who had once served in the military but now spent their days in peaceful retirement, took up arms and joined the fight. They may have been out of practice, but their resolve was stronger than ever. Back in the command center, General Marcus was making plans, his mind sharp as ever. The attack was intense, but he could feel the fire of battle burning inside him once again. He knew that their first move was crucial. They had to slow the enemy down, create a barrier long enough for the rest of the veterans to regroup and counterattack. He ordered the deployment of the colony's remaining weapons, even if it meant using them all at once. The first wave of the enemy came crashing down on them, and the battle intensified. Ships flew overhead, firing lasers that tore through buildings and sent debris flying. The ground shook as bombs hit the earth, leaving craters in their wake. The veterans fought back fiercely, their skills honed by years of experience. But even they couldn't deny the truth, they were outnumbered. Private Lucas took his shot, the crack of his sniper rifle echoing in the chaos. He downed one of the enemy ships, sending it plummeting to the ground in a fiery explosion. He quickly moved to reload, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that every shot counted. There was no room for mistakes. Sergeant Helena and her team reached the defense tower, where they were met with fierce resistance. The enemy soldiers were just as determined, but Helena's team was relentless. They fought hand-to-hand, using their old tactics to gain the upper hand. Every veteran knew that they had to fight like they were still in their prime, even if their bodies no longer moved as quickly as they once had. General Marcus stood tall in the command center, watching as his people fought. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. These were not just soldiers. These were heroes. They had fought for the galaxy, and now they were fighting to protect what mattered most, home. As the first wave of attacks continued, the veterans realized that the fight was far from over. The enemy ships were relentless, and they were only getting started. The veterans were beginning to feel the strain, but they refused to give up. They had survived wars that had torn entire civilizations apart. They weren't about to let their final days be taken away by an unknown enemy. The storm was only beginning. And the veterans would face it with everything they had left. The sky was alive with the sound of explosions and laser fire. The first wave had been brutal, but the veterans weren't giving up. The enemy might have had the advantage in numbers, but they underestimated one thing: the spirit of the old warriors who called this colony home. The veterans had fought wars across galaxies, surviving battles that many younger soldiers never could. And now, as the first wave of attackers pushed deeper into their home, the veterans were ready to strike back. General Marcus stood at the command center, his mind racing with plans. He knew they couldn't win by simply reacting to the enemy's moves. They had to take the fight to the attackers. He needed to turn the tide, and he knew exactly how to do it. His hands moved quickly over the controls, coordinating the remaining defenses. The enemy ships might be superior in firepower, but they didn't know the terrain. The veterans knew every inch of the colony, every hidden passage, and every weak point in the enemy's approach. "Prepare for a counteroffensive," Marcus ordered, his voice steady. "We hit them where it hurts. We don't give them a chance to breathe." The veterans sprang into action. They had seen the enemy's strength, but now it was time to show them the power of experience. Sergeant Helena, who had once led charge after charge on the battlefield, gathered her team. The young soldiers may have been brave, but the veterans had something they lacked: decades of battle-tested knowledge. "We don't have the luxury of time," Helena said, her eyes scanning the horizon. "But we do have one advantage: we've been here before. Follow my lead. We take the enemy's advantage away from them. We fight dirty." The veterans nodded, ready to move. They knew their role. They were no longer just soldiers, they were tacticians, strategists, and, most importantly, survivors. In the distance, the enemy ships began to regroup, preparing for their next wave of attacks. But the veterans weren't waiting for them to strike. They were going to hit first. Private Lucas, the sniper, climbed to the high ground once again, his rifle steady in his hands. From his perch, he could see the enemy commanders giving orders to their forces. He focused on one target, a commander who had been coordinating the attack from a central ship. With a deep breath, Lucas lined up the shot, his fingers steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The bullet flew, hitting the target square in the chest. The command ship, now leaderless, began to fall into disarray. That was the break they needed. The veterans didn't stop there. They set up traps along the colony's perimeter, using the environment to their advantage. They knew that the enemy was expecting a direct fight, but they were going to give them something else: an ambush. The first enemy unit to enter the trap was decimated in seconds. Laser fire erupted from hidden positions, catching them off guard. The veterans had learned long ago that the best defense was a good offense, and they had planned this counterattack with precision. Every veteran played their part, from the engineers who rigged the traps to the soldiers who laid in wait. Inside the colony, the civilians were still taking cover, but they could hear the sounds of battle outside. Many of them had never imagined they'd see combat again, but now they were praying for the veterans' success. They knew these warriors weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting to protect everything they had built together. Sergeant Helena's team moved in on the enemy's supply lines, sabotaging their weapons and cutting off their reinforcements. The veteran soldiers were relentless, slipping through enemy ranks like ghosts, taking down one opponent at a time. The attackers were disoriented and frightened. They had come to take over a retirement colony, expecting easy targets, but now they were facing a force of veterans they could not hope to match. General Marcus kept an eye on the larger picture. The enemy's ships were still advancing, but now they were scattered, unsure of what to do. The veterans had forced them to adapt, and in doing so, they had gained the upper hand. With a deep breath, Marcus knew it was time to strike the final blow. "Deploy the final phase of the plan," he ordered. The colony's remaining heavy artillery systems were activated, targeting the enemy ships from every angle. The first few hits were direct, creating massive explosions that rocked the attackers. The veterans had outsmarted the enemy, and now, they were hitting them where it hurt. But the fight wasn't over. The enemy still had more ships, and they were regrouping. The veterans had gained ground, but they weren't finished yet. General Marcus knew that they had only one shot at this. They needed to press the advantage before the enemy could recover. In the chaos, Lucas spotted another target. A larger enemy ship, a flagship, was hovering just beyond the range of the colony's defenses. If it wasn't taken out, the entire battle could be lost. He took aim again, his finger tightening on the trigger. This shot had to count. As the shot rang out, the flagship's engines erupted into flames, sending it spiraling out of control. It crashed into the ground, causing a massive explosion that sent shockwaves through the air. The veterans had done it. They had fought back the first wave and made a statement to their enemies: never underestimate the power of experience. The battle was far from over, but the veterans had proven that they were far from finished. The dust from the explosion still hung heavy in the air. The colony, once a symbol of peace, was now a war zone. But the veterans had done what they could. They had fought back with everything they had, using their old instincts, their tactics, and their experience. They had slowed down the enemy, causing disarray in their ranks, but now the enemy was regrouping, pulling back for a more coordinated attack. The first wave had been brutal, but the second would be worse. General Marcus stood at the command center, his face grim. The battle had been intense, but he knew it was far from over. The enemy had more ships, more weapons, and more soldiers. They had underestimated the veterans, but now they were coming with everything they had. Prepare for the second wave, Marcus ordered, his voice firm. This is it. This is the last chance we get. The veterans, though worn and tired, didn't need any more words. They were ready. They had been in worse situations before, but they had never backed down. They would fight until the very end. Outside, the calm was broken by the thunderous roar of the enemy ships as they descended upon the colony once again. This time, they were better organized. They were coming in larger numbers, their weapons aimed straight at the colony. The veterans had no choice but to face them head-on. Sergeant Helena gathered her team, her face set in a determined expression. "We need to hold them off for as long as we can," she said, her voice filled with authority. "We've got one shot at this. We fight until we can't fight anymore." The veterans scattered across the colony, taking up positions. Some moved toward the outer walls, setting up defenses. Others stayed close to the command center, ready to defend it with their lives. They had made a stand before, but this time, it felt different. They were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival, for their homes, their families, and the future of the colony. The first wave of enemy ships broke through the outer defenses, firing their weapons with precision. The air was thick with the sound of explosions and laser fire. The veterans fired back, their weapons roaring to life as they aimed at the incoming enemy forces. Each shot counted, each move was calculated, and every veteran knew that they were fighting for something much bigger than themselves. Private Lucas, the sniper, was once again perched on high ground, scanning the battlefield. He had taken down enemy ships before, but the second wave was proving to be more difficult. The enemy had learned from their mistakes. They were moving in tighter formations, their ships shielded from direct fire. But Lucas was patient. He knew that every shot had to count. His finger tightened on the trigger as he aimed at a ship that had slipped through the defenses. His shot rang out, and the ship exploded in a burst of flames. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Sergeant Helena and her team fought their way through the outer defenses, pushing back the enemy soldiers who had landed on the colony's surface. The battle had moved from the sky to the ground, and the veterans were no longer just soldiers, they were warriors once again. Helena fought with a fire in her eyes, her movements swift and deadly. She had led many charge after charge in her younger days, but now, each step was a reminder that age had taken its toll. Her joints ached, and her breath came in short bursts, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The colony depended on them. Inside the command center, General Marcus paced back and forth. His mind raced, thinking of every possible move, every tactic that could give them an edge. They couldn't hold out forever. The enemy would break through eventually, but there was something the attackers didn't understand. These veterans had been tested in ways that no one else could imagine. They had fought in battles where survival was not guaranteed, and they had won. This time, they weren't going to lose. The sound of the enemy approaching grew louder, and the ground shook with each step of their machines. The final wave was here. The veterans, despite their exhaustion, stood tall. There was no retreat. There was no surrender. The first explosion shook the command center as enemy bombs rained down from above. The veterans didn't flinch. They moved with precision, firing back at the ships that hovered above them. The walls of the colony trembled as the enemy landed their soldiers, ready to fight hand to hand. The veterans welcomed them with open arms. They may have been older, but they were far from weak. Helena and her team pushed forward, taking down enemy soldier after soldier with brutal efficiency. The enemy wasn't prepared for the veterans' ferocity. They had thought they were dealing with easy targets, but the veterans had one thing the invaders didn't: heart. And that heart was unbreakable. General Marcus knew this was their last stand. He looked out over the battlefield, his eyes scanning the chaos. The veterans had done everything they could. They had fought with every ounce of strength they had left. But now, it wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about making sure the next generation knew the price of peace. As the final wave of enemy soldiers rushed toward them, the veterans dug in their heels. They fought with everything they had, old wounds reopened, tired bodies pushed beyond their limits, and their hearts full of memories of wars fought long ago. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, but the veterans' resolve was stronger. They would not be forgotten. Not today. Not ever. The battlefield was a chaotic mess of smoke and fire, with the sounds of battle echoing in every direction. The veterans had fought with everything they had, giving their all to protect the colony, but it seemed like the enemy's forces were endless. The once peaceful grounds were now a testament to the strength and resolve of those who had once fought in galactic wars, and who now stood to protect the home they had worked so hard to build. Yet, despite their best efforts, the odds were growing slimmer by the second. General Marcus stood in the heart of the command center, staring at the view of the battlefield through a shattered window. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had led men and women through the darkest times, but he had never faced an enemy this determined. He knew the veterans were holding strong, but they were old, tired, and outnumbered. Their bodies were showing signs of the toll this battle had taken on them. Yet there was one thing they all still had: the will to win. Hold the line. Marcus shouted to his team. His voice was like a rallying cry, shaking even the youngest of the veterans. They had done the impossible already by holding back the enemy for so long, but now the final push was coming. The attackers had brought their last wave, an army like nothing they had faced before. The ships were bigger, better armed, and their soldiers were relentless. But Marcus had one trick left up his sleeve. "Lucas, do you have a shot at their flagship?" Marcus called over the comms, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. The veteran sniper had been key in picking off high-value targets earlier, but this was different. If they were going to win, they needed to take down the flagship, the heart of the enemy forces. From his vantage point, Lucas observed the battlefield through the scope of his rifle. His hands were trembling, but his mind was focused. He had never missed a shot before, and he wasn't about to start now. He scanned the massive enemy flagship, its shields glowing a faint blue, protecting it from most attacks. But Lucas had studied it for hours now, and he knew its weak point. He took a deep breath, steadying his hand, and fired. The bullet hit its mark. The flagship's shield flickered, and a massive explosion followed. The ship rocked violently, its engines dying in a fiery burst. The force of the explosion sent shockwaves across the battlefield, knocking several enemy ships out of formation. The veterans cheered as they saw the ship plummet from the sky, but the battle was far from over. In the wake of the flagship's destruction, the remaining enemy forces faltered. Without their central command, their coordination crumbled. The veterans seized the moment. Sergeant Helena, who had been leading the defense on the ground, rallied her troops. She knew this was their chance to end it all. Now, we push them back. Helena shouted, her voice fierce with determination. The veterans, despite their exhaustion, fought with renewed strength. They were old, yes, but they were far from done. They moved with a sense of purpose, clearing out enemy soldiers from the outer perimeter, taking down one enemy at a time. The enemy, now confused and leaderless, struggled to mount any effective defense. It wasn't just about firepower anymore, it was about strategy. The veterans knew they couldn't match the enemy in raw strength, but they had one advantage, their experience. They used everything they had learned over the years, the clever ambushes, the traps, and the old tactics that no enemy had ever expected. And it worked. With the enemy's leadership lost and their forces in disarray, the veterans pressed forward. They took control of the enemy's landing zones, pushing the invaders back step by step. The once quiet colony, now filled with the sounds of war, was turning in their favor. But there was still one more challenge. The enemy had one last ace up their sleeve, an emergency response team of elite soldiers, specially trained to break through any defense. They came charging in, their armor gleaming and their weapons ready to tear through anything in their path. The veterans knew that if these soldiers broke through, the battle would be lost. General Marcus didn't hesitate. He ordered the final push, sending every last veteran into the fray. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The elite enemy soldiers clashed with the veterans, and it was an all-out brawl. The veterans were old, but they were still dangerous. They fought with the skill and precision of soldiers in their prime, every move calculated, every strike purposeful. The elite soldiers may have been faster, but the veterans were smarter. They knew how to fight dirty. They had the upper hand. And when the dust finally settled, it was the veterans who stood victorious. The enemy forces had been pushed back, and the last of the invaders were either captured or scattered. The battlefield was still, the war over. General Marcus stood at the center, looking over the carnage. His heart was heavy with the weight of the lives lost, but he also felt a deep sense of pride. The veterans had done what they were born to do, they had protected their home. They had fought until their last breath and come out victorious. As the survivors gathered around, breathing heavily but with smiles on their faces, General Marcus spoke the words that would live in their hearts forever. Today, we proved that no matter how old we get, no matter how many battles we've fought, we never give up. We never surrender. And we never let our home fall. The veterans had won. Against all odds, they had stood tall and defeated an enemy that thought they could crush them. The colony was safe, and the legends of the veterans would live on.